Okay, this is a short video on helping remove rusted bolts. Here's a case where I broke off a bolt and I removed 2 bolts successfully. And I've been doing this for a long time, but I still managed to screw this one up. So I thought I'd do this short video to show you how I managed to do it. First, I'll show you where that bolt came from. This is the 97 Corolla, known as Black Beauty. So there's a lot of rust under here. This I'm taking off is a heat shield from the gas tank. Now, this cross member, if you look at it, you'll see that it's a big square piece, but inside, of course, it's hollow. And the place where I broke it off, that bolt goes through that. And it goes through it by a certain amount so that the threads on the other side of that are not in the metal itself. They are exposed to air, and over time they rust. So when you start to take out this bolt, what happens is the rust on the threads that are on the other side of the metal. So let's take this one as an example. This goes through a piece of metal, and then the threads that go all the way through, and you can kind of see that there's a little shiny part, that those threads are probably actually in the metal. Then there's out beyond that, it's rusted, a rusted part. Well, when metal rusts, it takes up more space. Okay, the iron oxide takes up more room than just the iron. When things rust, they expand. And so those threads are rusted. When you try removing those, they will get bound up in the threaded section. Those rust part is not originally in the threaded section. They're outside of the threaded section. As you remove it, they get drawn into the threaded section. Then they can get bound up in there because they literally don't fit properly, aside from being very abrasive. And if you noticed in that boxed cross member, I couldn't get penetrating solution, fluid, onto the other side because that's inside the box. So those threads, when they are drawn through, really don't benefit from the lubrication. Now, the technique for getting something like that out is to get the nut to back, you get it to break the bond, so you're starting to turn it. As soon as you can feel that you've got it turned at all, you then go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Because the idea is for the rust particles to become dislodged. So after you loosen it a little bit, when you tighten it up again, those rust particles will be pushed back out of the threaded area. And over time, they will become free from the material because the rust, although it takes up more space, it also flakes off. Okay? So the idea is back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Now, I was actually doing back and forth on this one. And then I got, after a couple of turns of going back and forth, I just was a little impatient. And I said, okay, now I'm just going to take it out like it's okay. Now, if you have a bolt that just goes straight into a block of metal, once you've broken the bond and turned it a couple of times, then there's no rust built up inside the threaded section, and you can remove it out after you've broken the bond more rapidly. But in the case where there's rust being drawn into the threaded section, you can never do that because that rusted section has to be pulled all the way through the threaded section. It could get caught up in that at any time. So in a case like this where it's going to be a real pain if you break one of these off, you just have to be very patient with it. Okay, now on the second one that I did, I was more patient. Okay, let me show you where that one came from. Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, it's right here. Now, if you look in there, you'll see that it's a cavity. It's threaded. This attachment point is threaded, and then there's just a cavity on the other side. And that cavity, those threads will rust as they go through that cavity. So as you're pulling them out, you have to go back and forth very slowly. Now, also, I continually spray the penetrating oil after every couple of rocks after I go back and forth, and it can take 15 minutes to actually take this out all the way through, you know, the 5 or 6 threads that you need to go through to get this all the way out. So patience pays off. Now the next thing is, this is the last one, the third one. I was able to get that one out successfully too, so I only screwed up the first one, and then I managed to be more patient on the other two now. Okay, this one came out of this strap, and I definitely do not, I want to reuse that strap. I do not want to get a broken bolt in there. Now you can see, obviously, this bolt goes through that, and it will be rusted. There's basically a nut on the other side of that built into that fixture. But that bolt goes through that to the point where there are rusted threads all the way through it, and those rusted threads have to get pulled through it. So I've got to rock it back and forth. Now here's an example where I can spray penetrating fluid and get to the other side of those threads, and that way, when the rust particles are dislodged, I can get the penetrating fluid onto them, and they will get washed away. So this is, of the 3, this was the easiest one, but it still took me 15 or 20 minutes, just very slowly. Of course, the reason I did it so slowly because I screwed up the first one, so I wasn't going to take another chance. Okay, this is just the first step of removing the heat shield. I still have plenty of other rusted stuff to remove. Now, this is the 97 Corolla, so this is already 23 years old, so there's plenty of rust to go around. Now, I should say that in doing this type of work, you always want to use a 6-point socket. You do not want to round off the hex head. That's just getting started. I mean, you will need to get a good grip on it. One way to screw this up is to round off the hex head to the point where you can't get anything on it. So the first step is to take a wire brush and to brush the hex head to get off anything loose. Originally, the hex head, when it's rusted, you won't be able to fit the proper size nut. This is a 10 millimeter. Before brushing the rust off, you may not be able to get a 10 millimeter on. You might actually be able to get an 11 millimeter on. But then, by putting the 11 millimeter on and taking it off and then brushing it, and so that you are knocking off the excess rust, you will get to a point where you will be able to use the proper size 10 millimeter. Always try to get to that point. In fact, in some cases, when the rust, here's one where it was particularly rusty, so I took off quite a bit of rust. What you find in that case, after removing all of the rust, that the 10 millimeter is actually too loose. So then you have to try to find the next smaller size. In this case, the 9 millimeter was too small. So I went with a 3/8 inch. A 3/8 inch happens to be about 9.5 millimeters when converted, and that gave me a snug fit, okay, on what was once a 10 millimeter nut. Okay, that's a snug fit. With the 10 millimeter, it was not a snug fit, and that would have rounded off these corners. Now, that might have not been a disaster, but it can be. So that's just another way to screw it up. Okay, on the first one that I broke off, okay, I started with the small driver. The reason to start with a small driver on this is you do not want to use more leverage than is necessary, and the reason is because what you're afraid of is breaking the bolt. So you use the smallest size that you have, because you know that if these threads are cleaned or not rusted, or if it's lubricated, that you don't need a big wrench, okay? You need a leverage maybe to break the initial bond, but you do not want to snap the nut. So that's why it's always safer in this case to use the smallest size, because that, and you, as you have to apply more force there, you won't get carried away as easily. Now on the first one, I did start using this one, and then foolishly, after I had broken the bond, I actually went to the 3/8 inch, 10 millimeter, and it was getting, I wasn't thinking actually, okay, it was just getting a little bit tight, but I thought it was going to come out, so I went with the larger size just so I could remove it more easily, and I ended up breaking it. Now, I'll probably be okay because this is a heat shield that this is holding on, and I can probably more or less rig it so it will stay on, and I don't need to use this particular bolt. I don't want to get into having to remove the broken bolt. The heat shield is not a critical attachment point, so I probably won't do that. But the real key on this is it's so much easier to spend the extra time to not break the bolt. Sometimes you do it anyway. You do your best you can, okay? In this case, I did not use heat. This was right next to the gas tank, and I might have been able to apply the heat to the point, but when it's this was one of them, for example, was attached to the strap that was on the gas tank, and the reason I'm removing the gas tank is because it is leaking in a couple of spots, and so I don't want to start a fire down there. So that makes this more difficult. Heat, for the most part, you can't go wrong with it. You heat something up, you let it cool off. But honestly, that's really to break the bond. That will not solve the problem of the rust that's on these threads on the other side of whatever it's going through. The heat will get the thing so it'll initially start to turn, but those rust particles, you have to work them back and forth to free them up so that they don't bind in. Okay, every time you push it a little bit further out, you are sucking in more rust into the threaded section. Then when you tighten it back up again, the particles that you've now broken or freed are being pushed out of the threaded section. Okay, the key is that it's hard. It'll be hard to break it with the smallest size that you have, because your force, you don't have that much force. So you can tell when it's getting bound up and when you need to go back and forth, put some more penetrating oil. Okay, so the video kind of went on longer than I wanted, but hope that makes my point here. Okay, don't screw it up.